All right, everybody, welcome back to In Progress. This is our weekly roundtable discussion of the political stories and issues and ideas that are top of mind for progressive folks all across the Lone Star State this week. My name is Chris Mosier. I'm the communications director here at Progress Texas, where we amplify progressive values and leaders and actions via our major digital network, which includes social media and podcasts and legacy media contributions and so much more. We reach millions of people all across Texas every month. I'm joined this week by a couple of our faithful staffers. Those would be Advocacy and Development Coordinator Tatum Owens. Hi, Tatum.
Hey, folks. Happy to be back on the radio and more on that soon.
Yes, there are radio developments for sure. And one of them is in San Marcos, from which we are joined by Haley Smith, our digital manager. Hi, Haley. How are you?
Hello. Happy to be here.
Excellent, excellent. So I have just had a ball this week. I've watched it so many times. I feel like I'm a sports fan watching a big football play over and over and over again. The Ken Paxton press conference that happened earlier this week on Tuesday morning, not in Dallas, but in Fort Worth. This was actually in Cowtown in Tarrant County where this happened. Ken Paxton was taking part in an event actually that was coordinated by the State Association of County Sheriffs. And this was a press conference at which he was flanked by 22, I believe, different county sheriffs, all wearing very similar cowboy hats, we noticed. I don't know if they coordinated that or if it's just kind of part of the uniform. This was in Fort Worth, after all.
Yeah, a sea of Stetsons, I think is how you put it on the Daily Dispatch.
A sea, a wave, a tsunami of Stetsons, let's put it that way. And of course, Ken wasn't wearing one, but I digress. What was funny about this, and we'll talk about the sheriffs, by the way, that's part of this too. We'll get back to that. What was interesting and entertaining for me, frankly, and I feel kind of bad about this, was the way this all concluded. This was a press conference that had been set up for Ken Paxton to be able to talk about his allegiance and his loyalty to law enforcement, which in itself is just fine, with this big group of county sheriffs. It was just Ken, the sheriffs, and the press. There was no audience. There was no public access to this event. It was one of those cameras only sort of things. But things kind of came off the rails a little bit for our illustrious Attorney General when the questioning began from the press. Immediately questions he didn't want to answer, and we'll get into that in just a moment. This got so bad and got so uncomfortable so quickly for Ken Paxton that his staffer, his handler, who was there helping with the event, pulled the plug, and the two of them really bolted for the door. They cut the thing short and left in the middle of a press going, hey, we've got lots of questions to ask. Anyway, let's get to Tatum Owens, who I want to ask this question. And again, I'm soul searching a little bit here. Is it wrong for me to be getting this much satisfaction and glee and pleasure from watching Ken Paxton experience such displeasure? I feel bad about it.
I think it became evident why Ken Paxton historically does not talk to the press, why he avoids it like the plague. And to answer your question, I think this guy brought this upon himself, and you can take glee in that. This is a public humiliation ritual for Ken Paxton, and embarrassing, but that is a minor harm against one person compared to the, I would say, millions of Texans that he has specifically targeted, whether you're a trans Texan, whether you care about abortion rights and reproductive health care and access. So, about half the population of Texas. It's a small thing to be concerned about in contrast to the great harms that he has put before Texas, just as the Texas Attorney General. I cannot imagine the harms that he would bring to Texas if he was actually one of our senators. Not to mention any of the controversies that actually pulled him out of that press event, which we'll talk about.
I have a question about that, though. Ken Paxton is a guy that has been riddled with public controversy and scandal after scandal. Does he even get embarrassed at this point? Do you think he's capable of feeling shame?
Can he feel
yes, just exactly. Question for the audience. Do you guys really think that he has nightmares about going to school without his pants on? It's hard to imagine Ken Paxton being capable of real human emotion. Is this an opportunity to empathize, or does he have the capacity for this, do you think?
Right.
You could just sure see on his face the recognition that he was about to be, kicked off a cliff in terms of there are no good answers for the questions. Let's say this: there were two questions that were asked. The first by Jack Fink, who works for CBS News Texas, which is based in Dallas, I believe. He was wondering about this massive amount of real estate that Ken Paxton has managed to accumulate, really over just the last maybe year or two, really since his divorce stuff started happening, which came, pretty closely out of the well, actually, I started to say it came out of the impeachment. It was a little bit later than that. There was an entire second affair that triggered the divorce, from what we understand,
Biblical grounds.
from State Senator Angela Paxton. Since that time, there's apparently been a buying spree of really nice real estate across several states, totaling up to about $9 million worth of value. Jack Fink was wondering about that. Hey, you make less than $200,000 a year as the AG of Texas. How are you managing to buy all of this awesome luxury real estate out there? It was all about, we're going to stick to law enforcement. We're here with the sheriffs. We're going to stick to law enforcement. This is where his handler began to get nervous as well. And then the second question came from Gromer Jeffers, who works for the Dallas Morning News. And he was curious about these stories lately that Ken Paxton, following his separation from his wife, Angela Paxton, he moved from Collin County to Denton County. And this was several elections ago. Ken Paxton, according to voting records and according to hard evidence, has apparently continued to vote under his address, at which he doesn't live anymore, back in Collin County. So this was something that Gromer Jeffers was curious about. And that really sort of broke the camel's back at that point. Very shortly thereafter, the handler, pulled the plug on the whole thing, and they got out of there. So Haley, to get back to your question, I digressed a little bit there. I think Ken Paxton has long dispensed with any personal guilt scruples. I don't think he feels bad about it. I think he felt bad about that moment because he realized that he was in a politically treacherous situation there. Mm-hmm. The more biting question perhaps right now for me is about the voters, is about people who will actually, how are those people still managing to ignore all of this stuff and continue to support this person as a political leader?
I think it's a reflection of Ken Paxton himself and the way that conservatives in Texas have had to adopt a certain way of thinking, which is, we're going to focus on what is immediately in front of me, with culture wars, with, I would say, a lack of empathy when it comes to the, you could say, democratic platform ideals of making sure public goods are available, like education and healthcare and all of these things that are founded in empathy and caring for one another in that way, where the other side of that is focusing on the economy and making sure everybody's good in that way. But really, it's a matter of self-interest. You can see it in Ken Paxton's activities as a person. He accrues wealth in a way that is corrupt, as we've seen, and has been very public facing, whether it's the wives and the girlfriends or the real estate properties. This is a man who wants power and lots of it across the board. So I think that the people that have voted for him, I would say a sect of them at least, are okay with him being in power because it's going to keep bringing them money and power, and that's fine. I think a large majority of Republicans who have previously voted for Ken Paxton are, as we've seen, facing the same question of, do I continue to support this person because I voted historically with this party, but this guy feels like not representative of these ideals any longer? It is that identity crisis that we'll see how it turns out in a couple of months. It's approaching quickly.
And there's a debate coming with James Talarico and Ken Paxton.
Well, supposedly.
Here pretty soon.
Would you guys do it?
Ken Paxton has not agreed to anything yet because, as you can see,
that's true.
Things don't turn out well when he goes public. So
I've thought about this in terms of of sports, and you're not likely to abandon your team if your team suddenly has, an internal scandal or something, especially if your team is winning. There's a lot of dopamine that goes into winning. And we can trace this all the way back up to the top, of course, with President Trump at this point. A lot has been ignored. A lot continues to be ignored by people who are quite literally voting against their best interests in many of the ways that Tatum just outlined there. By keeping this team in power, they feel like this is their team. They wear the red hat. This is their team. They continue to win. They want to continue to win. They want to keep winning. At this point, it becomes a matter of if they don't keep winning, there's going to be perhaps consequences in terms of investigations and impeachments and all this other. So there's plenty of reason for the Republican Party, frankly, at the federal level and here in Texas, to do anything they can to make sure that they stay in power, because the loss of power is going to come with consequences that are far beyond just the loss of power for them. And so there's a lot of thought going into that for sure. Interesting about the sports metaphor too. I wanted to mention this. Part of one of the many things that James Talarico might be able to ask in a debate, right, perhaps, would be about what happened at Texas Tech. What happened with a $250,000 donation coming from Cody Campbell, oil billionaire, and also the chief, or the chair, that is, of the Board of Regents at Texas Tech, gave Ken Paxton $250,000 on the day before. Ken Paxton, as Attorney General, threatened the Big 12 with a lawsuit if they were to interfere with Tech's fielding of a quarterback who had been caught and had admitted gambling on his own team when he was playing at Indiana, who happened to be the current national champions from last season. So there's a question about that as well. I was listening to a podcast today that actually is about Colorado football. Colorado is going to host Texas Tech in Boulder this year, and they brought up some really interesting things, which are that they have a quarterback issue there now because the quarterback that they wanted to keep, the guy who was guilty of cheating, Brendan Sorsby, he's out. The quarterback who is now going to be filling in, Will Hoffman, I believe is his name, is coming off an ACL injury and hadn't been expected to be ready even to be the backup quarterback until about game 3 or 4 of the season. So now not only is he the starter, but he's been moved up ahead of his recovery schedule. So what does that tell that kid? That the team, the main funder of the team, spent $250,000 to try to not have him start to start with, and they're going to be accelerating his recovery schedule, perhaps ahead of time when he should be out there playing with an injured ACL when he's still in recovery. So they're putting his physical safety at risk. Anyway, I digress into football there for a moment.
I think it's totally fair to, we're joining from Texas for one thing, which is like it's intrinsically connected to our identity. But the connection between sports and politics is something that I always love to investigate. It's an entire major at the University of Texas at Austin, where I went, as it would be for the Longhorn School. So I got to take a class there, and it has stuck with me through the years as I've engaged with other sports and sports events. Of course, the World Cup just finished up, which all sports are inherently political. They're tied to identity, our national identity in some ways with some of these teams. And so it was just interesting listening to you talking about Tech, because what it reminded me of was Trump's red card situation with the World Cup, and how the way that political officials will involve themselves within sports complexes is just very, very interesting. And it's even more compounded by corruption scandals like this, which are, this is not the only example, but it's interesting. And I think that I'll just add, I'm kind of sad that the World Cup has ended. And I think it was a really beautiful thing that Houston and our state got to bring so many people from around the world and invite them into our Texas identity in a time where our state leaders like Ken Paxton and Greg Abbott are showing some of the worst sides of what a Texan can be and do, and especially towards others, whether you're Texan or not, or American or not. It was really beautiful to welcome people with open arms and focus on selflessness and joy and all of the best parts of community. Anyway, now I digress about sports. It's my turn.
Yeah. And, I'll just to say one more thing about Texas Tech. It's ironic to see this happening at Texas Tech, which has historically been a quarterback factory.
Right.
This is the place that produced Patrick Mahomes and so many other great quarterbacks before that. Now to see them going through a scandal, a political scandal that has very much undermined their position at quarterback. It's going to be interesting to see what happens this fall. But let's get back to Paxton and the situation over there. And this is something I want to talk about. We frequently talk about the value of choosing your media carefully, choosing your news carefully, and realizing that depending on where you're getting your news, you're getting vastly different stories and vastly different depictions of what may have happened. And I noticed that coming out of this Ken Paxton thing, there were, it's been a big story, of course, the fact that this thing crashed and burned around Ken Paxton's head. But there are lots of news outlets, including the ones that are actually at the center of this story, that very much glossed over this ignominious conclusion to this press conference for Ken Paxton. For example, a WFAA, they managed to get one question in as literally he had his hand on the door and was on his way out. And a reporter from WFAA managed to ask a question. So that reporter was right in the middle of this thing collapsing and mentioned nothing about the way this thing ended in her reporting for WFAA in Dallas, which is one of the major historic, news outlets, radio and television coming out of Dallas, Texas. Gromer Jeffers, who's a guy that we have a relationship with, mentioned that Ken Paxton had dodged the questions and that he was uncomfortable, but didn't really talk about the way the whole thing concluded. And then Jack Fink, who was the guy that really kicked all this off with the question about real estate, he provided Paxton's answer to his final question, which basically was just a great big drag of James Talarico, but then said, and this is the quote, the way the thing ended, quote, "Paxton ended the news conference after that," unquote. Nothing about the handler intervening, nothing about literally him running for the door. Nothing about that from Jack Fink from CBS News, which brings me back around to what I'm talking about. CBS News is an operation that has been very much at the center of this right-leaning thing that we've seen with a lot of the major legacy news outlets. And so Jack Fink, I don't know how his job goes, but there definitely was a little bit of a glossing over as to the way this ended, emotionally and strategically for Ken Paxton. It makes me wonder if his bosses at CBS News weren't maybe happy with the way that came out.
I think that's the issue with the buyout of corporate media at this point. You don't know if you can trust what you're seeing at face value. And it's so unfortunate. These are CBS especially are institutions that are supposed to be at least like this is the summary of events, right? This is what happened. And as somebody who has lived within the media ecosystem in some way or some regard as a student journalist, and then as a podcaster, as an interviewer, and someone who cares deeply about Texas politics and trying to make it all better and make sure people are informed, it pains me. It pains me that in this critical election year, where Texans can vote their values at the end of this year and try to make it a better state and that protects each and every one of us, I wish for a different situation than what our news outlets have been given. Because if now's not the time to have a trusted and unbiased media ecosystem, I don't know when a better time would be.
Yeah, and Chris, I applaud you for having some modicum of guilt about laughing at this really embarrassing situation. Personally, I have none. I really relish in watching Ken Paxton embarrass himself.
Yes.
But you don't have to say it's embarrassing. You can just tell the facts of what actually happened.
Yeah.
You're right, Tatum. I think people deserve to know the candidates on their ballot for who they are and what they do, not the glossed over version that looks better on a CBS headline.
Right.
And, he hasn't agreed to a debate, but I would love to see one because people who are casting their ballot in November deserve to know. They deserve to know what they're voting for and who they're voting for, most importantly.
Absolutely. And I can't think of a situation, definitely not in the context of where hard questions might be asked and reasonable questions might be asked that would have to then be explained to a generalized, bipartisan audience. I don't know that has happened. If it has, not in a long, long time. Definitely not too much action on camera. Paxton has given, plenty of press conferences in his day and, clearly, a lot more press releases and whatnot. But I've noticed, really since the campaign has ramped up, I'm hearing his voice more often, and it's weird for me as a news junkie and as a politics junkie. I'm not familiar with Ken Paxton's voice. When I hear his voice, it's almost like hearing someone that you've not heard before. And I think that is part of this, that he has not really hasn't had to answer to any of his stuff on camera, really up until this, rather huge moment, I would say. So that brings us to the debate idea about a debate that the Paxton team has said should happen. James Talarico, from what we understand, has actually agreed to 3 different televised scheduled times. I'm not sure what those times are, but from 3 different media outlets. I hate to say this, but I almost feel like this press conference may have been just a little bit of a Joe Biden moment in terms of, just the really painful moment that we all saw with President Biden cratering in that particular debate with Donald Trump. This is almost a precursor. This is, everybody expected Joe Biden to do, fairly well or moderately well in that debate, which of course he didn't. But at this point, we see that Ken Paxton is extraordinarily vulnerable to be on a stage live in front of cameras up against James Talarico with moderators who will be tasked, who will be expected to ask hard questions of Ken Paxton. If it was me, I wouldn't do it. I'd figure out a way not to do it.
Yeah, I mean, he's gone his political career figuring out how to not do it. I guess I wouldn't be surprised if he chickened out, but yeah, I hope he doesn't.
I think it's interesting, the prospect of them two meeting, given the two events that these two candidates have had this week, with Ken deflecting and dipping. And then, of course, Talarico also held a community event, kind of a Q&A situation, a forum, excuse me, is the word I'm looking for, where he can have a listening session, basically, with Black Texans. Of course, that has been at the core of his campaign, or it's been a question at the core of his campaign, is will he address Black Texans' concerns following the departure of Jasmine Crockett from the U.S. Senate primary race? So that also happened this week. And in contrast to Ken Paxton, Talarico actually stays. There was a viral moment that came out of this debate where you have one of the Black women in the crowd asking or telling him, like, you need to stay and listen to our concerns. And what does Talarico do? He doesn't deflect the people at the event, but he stays and listens.
Of course not.
And I think that style of leadership, that type of leader who will actually take into account their constituents, is someone that does not mesh well with Ken Paxton's ideology and his actions, his history of actions as an attorney general. We haven't seen this guy. We just know that he does a lot of work behind the scenes, and hence a lot of corruption has gone down because of that.
I think it is the hard thing to do, to stay and not deflect and not run away and actually address people's concerns. And that is a hard and embarrassing thing to do sometimes, to stand up there while people are angry at you and receiving that anger and trying to turn it into something positive and constructive is a really difficult thing. And I'm sure it's embarrassing and probably like one of those things that like keep you up at night, even if you are a seasoned politician, right?
Sure.
But real, normal, ordinary people go through hard and embarrassing things every single day. And if you want to be a leader that represents those people, you have to be willing to put yourself in their shoes. And I don't see that coming from Ken Paxton. I think regardless of what side of the aisle you're on, if you're looking for somebody who's an everyman, I don't think it's Ken Paxton.
What was he expecting from this press conference? What he was expecting was for the press to go along with his constructed narrative of this law enforcement, buddy thing that he was trying to put up with all of these sheriffs on that stage. He expected the press to play along with his chosen narrative, and luckily in that situation they didn't. I would say though, back to James Talarico, we've seen from a lot of these media outlets that glossed over the terrible crash and burn that Ken Paxton went through on Tuesday. A lot of those same outlets have characterized Talarico's situation in Houston last Sunday as embarrassing,
right?
And that his voice shook, and that he was somehow flustered, and that he was somehow, should be embarrassed by what happened. When really, in contrast with what happened with Ken Paxton, to me, James Talarico should be totally proud.
Yeah.
To have stood up and to have answered those questions, to have answered those very valid questions,
yes,
from the Black community in Houston. There is a ton of validity to that, and it was great to see him do it.
I think the way that the news reported the Talarico event, some of it rubbed me the wrong way, because the way that Black Texans were being talked about in some news headlines, I think it sensationalized the outrage, and that is a dangerous precedent to set, saying
Sure.
that, because people have said over the course of this Senate race, we have seen Black Texans' identities be diminished and discounted. And of course, that is what this forum was meant to address, right? That Black Texans are integral to progress in Texas. And for Texans' concerns and Black Texans' concerns to be sensationalized in a way, saying, oh, you're just angry, it plays into that stereotype, right? Like, no, these are real Texans with real concerns who have a history of being discounted by so many people in either party, whether there was Republican or Democratic representatives. We know that there's a history there. So I, for one, was really glad to see that there was a long conversation taking place at this forum in a way that wasn't just another presser event. Talarico has had so much media attention, but this was a conversation, that's what we hear every day in Texas politics, right? You need to start conversations within your community. And this was an example of at least starting that, right? We need to come together and listen. And Ken Paxton is not a good listener, as we can tell.
Okay, yeah, what a week, and there is a little bit of a delay. Perhaps you may be hearing this in podcast land a few days after we record it, and of course it'll be on the radio in Houston on Sunday. But I will be shocked to the bejesus belt if Ken Paxton comes out of this situation and actually accepts even one, much less three debates with James Talarico coming out of that situation in Fort Worth. I did want to mention real quick as we wrap up the role of county sheriffs in all of this. Let's go back to the beginning here and remember that Ken Paxton was having this press conference really very much as a show of a particular group endorsement by the Sheriff's Association of Texas, or at least by the sheriffs that were present there, 22 of them total. I'm not sure how many sheriffs are, we have 254 counties in the state, so not quite that many, but a good number of them. Sheriffs, as we know, or you may or may not know, county sheriffs are elected on a partisan ballot. They run as Republicans and Democrats. However, there's an internal sort of tension that comes with that job. Sure, you may have been elected as a Democrat, you may have been elected as a Republican, but once you're the county sheriff, you're supposed to be administering the law in an unbiased and non-political sort of way. These 22 sheriffs, I'm going to wager a lot of them are in pretty red counties. I think that's probably pretty likely. We did see that the Tarrant County Sheriff was there. He actually spoke for a moment. Collin County's sheriff was there. Those are both very much purpling urban and suburban places. There are loads and loads of progressives and Democrats who live in Tarrant County and Collin County who have now seen their county sheriff stand up for Ken Paxton in a very public and partisan sort of way. So that to me is problematic. I wanted to bounce this off of you guys, and this is not something new. This is something that is just a factor of this particular law enforcement position. But Haley, to you first, what crossed your mind seeing what amount to a whole bunch of cops backing up Ken Paxton?
So you have people in law enforcement who, on the line of duty every day, they're in their hats, they're really big and manly, and Ken Paxton running away afraid from 2 questions.
Yeah.
I wonder what they feel about all this.
Yeah.
So much has happened with Ken Paxton. We talked about his many, many scandals, and how does that not make you feel different about the guy? But I wonder if seeing it like real life in person, you're standing there in your Stetson and you see him running away.
Bail.
Yeah, you're bailing on this thing, and it's supposed to be about you. Like, what a great job you do, and like how important it is that you have support, and then he's the one that dips out of there.
Can I throw in just real quick, and I don't want to sound sexist when I say this, but I gotta say it. He was rescued by a 23-year-old girl.
No, I think that's the optics of it, right? People have been saying he doesn't look manly. This is it's at the core of it, right? Like he left a group of men and a woman came to rescue him. It's part of the series of events.
Literally.
Yeah. Yeah. And it wouldn't be a conversation if this whole masculine posturing wasn't so pathetic to begin with,
right?
It really is. It is just, again, I find myself just very, very entertained.
But yes, I think sheriffs have a responsibility to remain somewhat impartial, even though it is a partisan position. And it is a bit embarrassing just beyond this whole thing to stand up there and try and, posture the way that they did.
All right. Well, we'll wrap it there. Guys, thanks so much. We look forward to, at this point, it's just really exciting to see, will he agree to a debate, at which point we have got one heck of a TV moment coming up, or will he cave, or will he decide he doesn't want to debate after all, at which point, to me, back to the original theme of this, how much are potential and maybe historic Republican voters going to continue to ignore from this particular candidate? Yeah. We shall sure see soon. Progress Texas amplifies progressive values, leaders, and actions while campaigns come and go. We're the permanent home for progressive media and action in the Lone Star State. For Haley Smith and Tatum Owens, thank you so much for listening. Whether you're hearing us on Texas Public Radio or on the podcast feed, more information about what we do is available at progresstexas.org.